So I want to throw this to you, Leena, in regards to the idea of land acknowledgement. What brought you to the idea of having a conversation around that?
It's so fascinating that you bring this up because I was actually presenting at a conference, and conference-wide, they did a land acknowledgement. And then it was time for all of our individual breakout rooms. And so it was time for my conference presentation. And I remember getting feedback saying, this was a great presentation. However, I was bothered that you didn't do a land acknowledgement. And I'm wondering, when I hear that, I'm thinking, okay, so are we getting to a place where the land acknowledgement is a performative checkbox? Where, okay, we did it conference wide, now we have to do it in every single conference room. And for me, when I think about the land acknowledgement, I think about some of the other Native American conferences, and I asked, do they do land acknowledgements? And they don't. And that's what's fascinating, is that, of course, there's no expectation. They know that their land was colonized, and the importance is for others to acknowledge it. But how do we go beyond the acknowledgement? How do we go beyond this performative stage where, okay, we did it, check? Because the problem is that we can do as many land acknowledgements as we want, and yet here we are in the same situation where rights are being compromised.
There's so many areas I want to go with that, because as I'm listening to you talking, it sounds like sometimes I remember like everybody was mad if you didn't talk about pronouns. It's like, you didn't say your pronouns before you started your session, your workshop. I'm supposed to say he and like him, and like that was a big thing. And then there was pushback. And so I feel like sometimes a lot of, like you said, performative, trendy, these are things that are people focus on for this moment. It goes away sometimes, or it's viewed a certain way. I want to start with land acknowledgement. What does that mean? Because folks that are listening to this may not know exactly what we're talking about in regards to land acknowledgement.
It is a formal statement that recognizes the indigenous peoples who have historically and currently steward the land on which an event, institution, or gathering is taking place. So it acknowledges the historical and ongoing presence of indigenous communities and the harm caused by colonization, while honoring their resilient sovereignty and cultural heritage. So typically this could be something like, we're going to read a statement. Sometimes what we do, sometimes we go in and we look up the actual land that we are occupying. So for example, if I'm in Honolulu, I'm occupying Native Hawaiian lands. So we would do that, but just honoring and giving space for that particular statement to be read and acknowledged.
Okay, and you touched on a piece that I was going to ask you about. So, because I've heard different forms. I've heard folks that'll say, you know, we recognize we're on the lands of indigenous tribes, and then I've heard acknowledgments where it's like, we recognize we're on the lands of a specific tribe. They actually named the actual tribe, and then I've actually heard, this has happened before, where they said we recognize that we're on the lands of the specific tribe who originally signed or forcibly signed a treaty on X amount of day. And it was like, they'll go into a little bit more detail as opposed to like a one sentence type of thing. So I've seen different types. Has that been your experience as well?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, as recently as a few weeks ago, we saw the viral video in New Zealand with the Maori, the treaty that was signed. And so we're seeing this happen in present day, of how now actually I personally was looking more into that, because the what do you call the rights of Maori in New Zealand, they actually have a really good system of like their own schooling and language preservation, things that didn't happen for Native Hawaiian. So it was actually a good playbook, and now it's getting compromised with the new legislation, and hence the protest. So much of this is, again, like you said, going beyond the land acknowledgement. Well, why are we talking about this?
Yes.
Let's talk about Navajo languages, Maori languages, Hawaiian language, and the laws that were passed beforehand, where Native Hawaiians it was criminalized to speak in Hawaiian, and then what that's led to. We need these laws and this legislation to be able to preserve what's left.
Okay. All right. I think we established a good baseline conversation about land acknowledgement. How do we go beyond just acknowledging however you present it? I acknowledge that we're doing this session, we're on the lands So how do we go beyond that?
Absolutely. And I always refer, and of course, referring to the book, I always refer people to chapter 11. And chapter 11 focuses on indigenous and native ways of knowing. And I think as we are in our formalized education, we lose that. And that's why when we think about education on reservations or in charter schools, I can't get mad at the proliferation of charter schools in Hawaii because the standard public school in Hawaii doesn't focus on Native Hawaiian culture. And so people that are yearning for the preservation and the renaissance of Native Hawaiian culture, they're going elsewhere. Let's look at Kamehameha, which is a private school that focuses on Native Hawaiian culture, but not everyone can get in. So there's obviously a need. However, our standard public education system is not addressing that need. And that is why we're looking at culturally responsive teaching and wanting to transform and disrupt education because of that need. So some of the specifics that I go into is first taking the first step of learning more about the culture. What land are you on? And then going deeper. Are there indigenous elders that you can seek out? And are there indigenous elders that you can bring into your classroom, especially bringing in the knowledge that they have experienced and utilized? So another example is, again, Native Hawaiian culture. And forgive all the Native Hawaiian examples. My husband is Native Hawaiian. My children are Native Hawaiian. And so I myself have gone through the personal experience of
Don't
learning
apologize.
about
Don't apologize.
And it's interesting because I just happened to be in this personal experience of learning about Hawaiian history. However, anyone can do this. Anyone can learn about Navajo history and whatnot, and being able to teach that culture. So I have this 4-step protocol where it starts with comparing, questioning, discussing, and inviting community.
Okay, tell me more.
So when you first start with comparing, one of the ways is to learn side by side about, let's say, for example, you're learning about astronomy. Well, you can look at Native Hawaiian ways of knowing and look at how the wayfinding culture, looking at the stars, and bringing in, of course, everyone knows about Moana. So just bringing in the Native Hawaiian ways of knowing and then comparing it to present day astronomy. And you can look at that side by side, because I think what happens is there's a lot of mythology and culture that is not taken seriously. And I do think that there should be some way to at least look at the side by side to see, well, what is it that brought about these myths? And is there some truth? And is there some science behind it? Because it honors the culture, and you're also learning the science as well. And then we go into questioning. Again, looking at, well, what could be truth? What could be myth? How did these come about? And asking questions instead of just saying, that's a myth. We don't believe in that. We can actually start to question, well, how did we come about this? And then having a discussion of stories. So then we go into discussing the indigenous stories, the backgrounds. And sometimes, in fact, a lot of the time, storytelling is such an integral part of Native ways of knowing. And it's a great instructional strategy to remember things. So, for example, the moon, being able to understand so many Native stories that are aligned with the moon, and then connecting the moon to the moon cycle. So you can just see the side by side of the storytelling and the content knowledge. And then finally, inviting community. So having community members that can share space and really have an alliance.
All right. I got, again, a lot of questions here. So I used to work on a reservation. And one of the things that I've recognized, especially when we're considering indigenous elders, a lot of our elders experienced Indian boarding schools, a lot of historical trauma and challenges. So for my white educators, they were very timid and shy when it came to reaching out to the elders, because they felt like they may have reached out in the past, it didn't go well, or they were just kind of concerned with how things might go based off of history. So do you have any thoughts on ways to approach elders? Let's just start with, let's be broad enough. Ways to maybe approach elders to invite them to our classrooms and speak and things like that.
So I'll start with an experience that was very recent as our STEM for All Leadership Symposium. Mm-hmm. I invited some teachers from the Hawaiian Charter School to come as well. And it was such a fantastic experience to have this rich diversity in the room. And one of the practices that they do is the Oli, where they open the symposium or they open whatever that they're doing, whether it's a ceremony or if it's an event, but they open the ceremony and then they close it. So it's a very particular structure. So I thought after my keynote, I could do the Oli. And so I approached them and I said, I would love to have you conduct the Oli. And they said, I'm thinking in my head, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to be a rich cultural experience. And they said, I need to stop and think about this. And I said, oh, what am I doing? Did I do something wrong? And they kind of talked about it. And they said, unless we're opening the entire symposium and then closing it, there's a particular protocol that we have to do. We can't do this. It can't just be like a sidebar thing after you've done the keynote and then we do the Oli. And for me, I thought, wow, one, that was very educational. Two, it's like, okay, let's go back to the original programming. And next year we'll figure out how to make sure that we are on protocol. So I think there has to be a sense of humility and also just knowing that you're going to make mistakes and you're not going to know all the answers. And that's where having the Indigenous Alliance comes into play. So going back to your question, if you reach out to an elder and they're like, you know what, I'm not about this. Last time I had a terrible experience. No, I think it's about asking more questions and being in a place of curiosity instead of being in a place of being offended.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer. Thank you for that example there. Now, another thing I want to throw out, again, based off of my personal experience, because we say myths a lot but a lot of this is what they believe, right? They believe the earth might have been created a certain way and there's different things there. And I've seen some folks get in trouble with referring to certain things as myths, even though this is what they personally believe as far as faith. And I always try to compare it to like Christianity, for example. There's a lot of things that we can't prove. It's faith-based. And why is it that what we believe as Christians is not viewed as myths? But if it's outside of that, it's something that's considered as a myth. So I'm just curious. And again, this is just based off of conversations I've had with some tribal members. It's just like, why is what we believe got to be a myth, but what you believe is the real thing? You know what I'm saying?
Right. In fact, I opened the chapter with a quote from one of the teachers when she was teaching about Earth's history and the geology of the islands. Another one of her students actually shared about some of the quote unquote myths that are part of their culture. And so the teacher responded, you don't really believe in that, do you? And again, it was a moment of reflection for this teacher to say, oh, wow, like I can't believe that the student was offended. What can I do? And it was a beautiful moment for the teacher to look back and say, wait a minute, this is an entire cultural identity. So to name it as a myth, to completely relegate it to disbelief, that is compromising an entire culture. And so that's why I go back to the protocol of comparing and questioning. And again, it goes into saying that you're not saying one is not true, but for another way, like let's say you're talking about the science and you're talking about the scientific concepts in the next generation science standards or in the standards in particular, and you're going over the steps of how this was proven and whatnot. And we may not know the specific steps for some of the indigenous ways of knowing, but we have the stories to help us make sense of it. So I think as a teacher, personally, I wouldn't say one is untrue. What I would say is this is what I know that I can prove on this day. However, this is some of the storytelling that goes with it. And it always goes back to storytelling. Anytime we tell a story where we want to fact check it, we want to understand the basis, and all we can say is, well, this is the story that goes with it. Every time we even learn about new legends, legend says da 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 da, that's why. And it's just another opportunity for us to form a context and again to form a memory around something.
I love this. Thank you so much for that, because again, I've seen those kind of conversations not go well, because a lot of our indigenous folks, again, from what I've seen, is like, well, you're coming across as if you're right, we're wrong, or what you believe is better than what I believe, and kind of like what you touched on. It's like someone literally said, you don't really believe that. But there's a lot of stuff that we believe in our religious faith that, again, you can't really prove. It's just like a lot of faith-based or oriented type of doctrines and things like that. So I'm glad that you touched on it that way. Thank you.
And I also think that when we look at it from a storytelling perspective, one, it's fun. We get to learn and hear all of the different stories as well. And when we align the storytelling with the science, again, it goes back to our memory of how we can connect more. Like, for example, with the moon phases, I probably would remember it more, especially if I connected to the story of Mahina and she's walking to the moon. Now, did she actually take steps and walk to the moon? Probably not, but it was a really fun story for me to connect the content, especially when the content is phases of the moon cycle. Like,